My thesis is titled Audubon Kindergarten, and my professor for my master's thesis was Professor Nick Jelpy from FIU. So we started the studio looking at the works of Mark West. Mark West was an architect who focused on and wrote a book about a process known as fabric forming concrete. So he basically outlined a lot of techniques and their results from using fabric to mold concrete, as opposed to the traditional method of a plywood form or anything like that. And his idea was that, concrete is such a liquid and malleable material, it can be shaped to whatever form you want. So why would you limit it to only rigid angles and things like that? On top of that, using fabric instead of board formwork or anything else is way less impactful on the environment. You create way less waste. A couple sheets of fabric in the landfill is way better than all of the used up wood that just gets thrown away immediately after. So the technique in particular that I decided to focus on from Mark West's studies was a method called the jacket and liner. And what that involves is a soft inner tube of fabric, which is then wrapped in a harder shell of fabric. And then you can do whatever you want to that harder outer shell. As you can see in that first image, they've cut circular holes into that. And then when you fill the inner liner, these holes actually bulge out with concrete and give you what you see in that second image there with the mold removed. And then you can also apply, in this example, they're using that plastic construction fencing to get that example of what looks like alligator skin there on the right. So started by kind of conducting these small scale experiments in the studio with hard jackets and soft liners. Took a long time to get to this point. It's, really a factor of what the makeup of that inner liner is. Tested a bunch of different materials and decided on a mix of spandex and nylon and cotton would be the best under the certain circumstances of pressure to create the kind of bulging that you see has resulted in this first trial here. So another issue that we ran into was how to mix the plaster that you use. So for these smaller scale examples, I opted to use plaster instead of concrete because of a much finer aggregate. So that allows much more detail to come out in the molds. But little did I know that a huge issue is the mix, the water to plaster ratio. Too wet and the water just seeps straight out of the fabric, since it does have some porosity to it, and just your plaster becomes super dry. And then obviously too dry and you don't get any of the undulating forms because you don't have any, the plaster is not workable enough. But after a lot of trial and error, finally got a result similar to what was shown in the book, just on a smaller scale here. And that second one with the mold removed was using that same fabric, but wrapped with a chicken wire from Home Depot and then removed. So after we did all these, mock-up models and experiments, we thought, it's one thing to actually do this in person, but how would you draw something like this, right? Like organic modeling can get you so far, but to have a physical line drawing of something with these kinds of undulating shapes and bulges is not as easy to do as you would think. We tried a bunch of different drawing techniques and methods to arrive at what we think was the best method of portraying it, which is mocking it up in 3ds Max first. So I decided to use the cloth modifier command in 3ds Max to actually apply pressure to an inner virtual liner and place that in a modeled tube, which provided me with an actual result of what that thing would look like, as opposed to having to model it and fake it. Then took that resulting geometry into Rhino and applied curves to the surface. And then that way you can kind of approximate, the bulges on this tube. So, with that in mind, we're saying, okay, so we have a 3D shape. What happens if you, try to make like something like a wall panel out of this idea, right? So same techniques, right? Just using a flat panel as if you unrolled that tube to kind of create these bulges in a wall. And again, drawing them. So from there, we started looking at a couple precedents. Obviously the first thing that came to my mind was Yayoi Kusama, because her work involves all of these undulating shapes and polka dots. So that seemed like a logical first step to think about. And what interested me about her work is that how even a 2D, drawn surface pattern can really influence the entire room in like a three-dimensional space. It creates kind of a very interesting environment that's way more than just what one surface, you really think would do. And then we started studying Isamu Noguchi and looking at some of his sculptures and how he, plays with plaster and other materials to kind of create these undulating forms. This is a piece called Lunar Landscape that he made, and you can see that it's a plaster. It's not a cast, but it's actually sculpted, and it has some strings in tension with some little cork or wood balls, and then some LED lights inside. So, we can look at this in detail, but really the challenge was, okay, so again, even if we can study these things and be influenced by them, how do we draw them? So taking the techniques that, we learned from the initial experiments, I modeled this in Maya, which kind of seems similar to the way that, in a sense, it's kind of like a virtual sculpting situation there, and then took that 3D model into Rhino and applied contours throughout it to make it visible in plan. And I think that this kind of gets the point across as to what this 3D shape looks like. And then another technique, which is similar to what I did with the tube, but applied to this surface to kind of see this better in 3D. The topography lines really don't work very well in 3 dimensions. So another project by Isamu Noguchi was the Slide Mantra, which is in Miami. And what's interesting about this project is, even though it seems like a simpler geometry than the lunar landscape, in reality it's very difficult to actually model something like this because of the combination of organic and rigid edges. So again, we decided, let's see how we can draw something like this. And this was kind of the result. And again, just seeing how the spaces kind of evolve in plan and section from what seems to be a very simple thing from the outside, but when you really study it, is actually quite complex. So we moved on then to kind of combine all of our research and create what we called kind of a conceptual 3-dimensional, I guess, gravity-free playground, right? So what can fit, how can you design a 3-dimensional playground using the techniques and ideas that you learned from studying the past and fit it within a 3-dimensional cube that works on every plane. So in this drawing, you can see kind of some of the tensile elements that are from the Noguchi sculptures, as well as some of the undulations and bulges that come from fabric formed concrete. And then the drawing techniques of drawing the isocurves along all of the surfaces to kind of project this in a 3D way, but from a 2D drawing. A couple more images of that, more section cuts to see the interiors of that. And then applying the jacket and liner technique in kind of a more literal way of, showing what's being restrained potentially by a liner or a jacket, and then what liner is being pulled through it. So then we decided to start studying our site, which was in Audubon Park in New Orleans, Louisiana. Obviously, what's interesting about New Orleans is that it's shaped like a bowl. So the land is actually, a few feet below sea level, and the only thing keeping the water out is the levees across the perimeter of the city. So Audubon Park is actually designed by Olmsted, and it's historically was supposed to have a continuous water feature and just a bunch of open greenery, a very like classical Victorian kind of order to the layout of the park, with some very kind of orthogonal shaped paths and lines that lead to a small kind of building, like a greenhouse kind of thing, with one continuing loop around the whole park. On the left is what the park actually looks like today, and that actually includes a golf course where there was supposed to be just an open green area with segmented pieces of water that act as, the water hazards for the golf course, as well as a fully functioning zoo with a lot of, different zoo animals. And then one section that's called the Fly. That's the section on the other side of the levee that has a few sports facilities, baseball fields and things like that, and also this really nice boardwalk that's along the Mississippi River. So just looking at the program distribution of this park and how the edges are defined by the neighborhood, and one street that cuts straight through the middle of the park is Magazine Street. And in New Orleans, Magazine Street is full of a bunch of, it's a very active street, retail, restaurants, bars, things like that. So it gets a lot of traffic. And that path actually cuts straight through the middle of the park, separates the golf course from the zoo in general. There's other program there too, but. So selecting a site, this being a kindergarten and all, we thought that it was best to focus on a site that's kind of in proximity to the zoo, have some sort of, build maybe some sort of relationship with the zoo, allow the kids to go, make trips there, visit the animals, whatever, study them, come back to school. We selected this big open field of grass that's kind of located off to one edge, so it's easy to access, doesn't create traffic of people coming in, and it already has a bus loop there to drop off for the zoo, which could be doubled as the school bus loop. So then we moved on to kind of programming and laying out what this building is going to look like. So looking at a precedent of Aldo van Eyck's Amsterdam Orphanage, a very interesting building. It's very programmatically complex and different from a lot of other buildings, especially of that time, in that it houses different aged kids in different sections of the project and distributes them all throughout the areas, separating them for safety reasons and things like that, but also creates all of these inner courtyards and lays out the spaces really interestingly. And, a nice thing was that it also featured these kind of domes on the roof, which reference back to kind of the idea of the jacket and liner and the bulges. So a couple of close-up shots of the building. You can see that there's a heavy reliance on circles, the geometry of circles. Aldo van Eyck thought that creating these areas are just, areas for kids to gather. Just implying that there's a space in between there will draw people to gather in that area and just use it as a space. And then some details of the undulating roof with these little domes of glass on top. So then we took the building at full scale and laid it out what this building would look like on the physical site at a 1-to-1 scale, and from there laid out a program for a kindergarten using the influences from the programmatic layout of the Amsterdam Orphanage and fitting that a little bit better on the site. So here you have an overall park plan of that section with the school building on the left, and on the right you have a kind of closer up site plan. So you see that there's a lot of greenery around the area, as well as a huge parking lot behind it for the zoo. So it provides a lot of parking for the faculty, staff, and student drop off potentially, as well as a bus loop. So programmatically, there's 10 classrooms for the children, an administration office, a teacher's lounge, gym slash cafeteria, lab, indoor zoo, and an outdoor class slash playground area for the kids to kind of have a safe enclosed space to hang out, go to recess without the fear of running onto the street or anything else like that. And then on the second floor, you have an indoor playground as well as an arts and crafts area and a reading room. So a couple of section perspectives of the project. So the ideas of Isamu Noguchi kind of came into the design of the courtyard slash outdoor playground area. He has a project called Play Mountain, which has features built-in stairs and a slide on the actual on this actual hill. So using that as an inspiration to kind of create these mounds, as well as the idea of the bulges from the fabric formed concrete to activate this space and create elements for children to interact with. And on top of all of that, concrete is a harsh material. It's not something that you would think of as necessarily being the correct material to build a kindergarten out of. So softening some of those hard edges with round undulating surfaces, but also activating those surfaces so they're inviting kids to come and actually play on them and use them. Also designing some of the furniture for the classrooms in a similar fashion so that things kind of just emerge from the surfaces of the project. And on top of the mounds, similar to the Amsterdam Orphanage, I placed some domed skylights to allow light to filter in an interesting and playful way for the children in the classrooms and cafeteria and indoor playground space. And this project actually features individual outdoor courtyards for each classroom as well, and in the teacher's lounge. So if there's an outdoor activity, if it's a particularly nice day, you can take the kids out to the private playground of your classroom and teach class out there. So you're kind of creating individual smaller units of community for the students, as well as bringing them together in the larger playground in the middle as well. So here's just like a rough idea of how something like this would come together, using the hard outer shell to hold a piece of plywood or to hold a piece of fabric in place, and punching out openings and casting concrete in there and allowing the concrete to flow out and fill the voids in the hard outer shell, of course just placing the dome windows in between. And then here's an axonometric view of the project. You can see the individual courtyards flanking the outsides of the project, and then that large inner courtyard in the middle. That large dome or half dome in the center that has a staircase up to connecting the indoor and outdoor playgrounds, as well as having a slide that's built right into it and an underground section for kids to go and play. Taking influence from Noguchi's slide mantra, building spirals and slides within some of these domes as well, and also creating opportunities for seating and just climbing up some of these domes and planting trees in the middle of them. So here's a rendering of an interior space of a classroom. You can see how everything is kind of built in and comes out of the ground or out of the walls, and everything kind of features some of these undulating bulges. Kids are, especially in kindergarten, like things like this, right? They want to go touch everything and put their heads in some of these nooks, right? Look out of the dome and just have fun with each other. A view of the cafeteria space featuring a lot of these little domes, creating this interesting lighting on the inside there. The library, right, with built-in bookshelves that come out of the ground and similar desks as in the classroom spaces and tables. And then here's a view out of one of those little portals looking out onto the outdoor playground. And a view of the indoor playground with the kids using, conventional playground equipment, as well as some, bulges on things for them to climb up and, just interact with. And then I think this is the last view, and that's just a view of the exterior courtyard slash playground with, you know, how it would probably look like in recess with all the kids running around using all the playground equipment and slides and things like that. And that's it.
Great, man. Man, I think this is a great project, and I know that when I first found out that you guys were making a kindergarten utilizing concrete formwork, that sounded like a crazy idea to me, and I think you've done a beautiful job in making such a rough material seem so light and so inviting. So I commend you in every single aspect of this project.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, man. I think the idea of taking what's traditionally, I guess, a more government building, which is a school. You know, I really have to commend you on the fact of taking something that's traditionally executed as very banal as a school, and really creating something that's going to harbor education and like playful thought and just like expression through the architecture itself. And I think that's what really embodies the heart and soul of the project, which I think you pulled it off 100%, man. And it looks great.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
All right. I mean,
yeah. Thank you for sharing your thesis, and we commend you on all the hard work. So, you know, definitely winning your studio
Thesis award
is definitely, you know, seen here, and it shows that you put the right amount of intensity and thought into your project, and took everything from your precedent to the material studies. Like, you really thought about everything and put it in the final product.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually just recently learned too that I won the AIA Bronze Medal Award for this project as well. I haven't been able to get it though because I'm in New York and, you know, it's back in Miami, but hopefully go down soon and actually receive it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll catch up when you do that.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, great hearing from you, man. I hope you guys found this useful. I think this might be some very helpful information for any of you working on your thesis currently, or for anyone thinking about architecture, and you can see how some of these radical ideas can be really good opportunities for you to experiment and hopefully be like Kevan and land on a very successful solution.